The year is 1990, and the wrestling landscape was undergoing numerous changes. The WWF had passed their torch to the Warrior, while the NWA passed the torch to his former Blade Runner partner, Sting. In the AWA, well, it was knocking on heaven's door, to put it nicely. But a new federation would come onto the scene. Led by an eccentric lifelong fan, the promotion would try to attract fans and wrestlers alike away from the big two. Its failure is legendary and has made it one of the most requested promotions for this series. Here we go. This is Defunct Championship Wrestling, Episode 14, Herb Abrams, UWF. Now, a lot has been written and said about Herb Abrams, the UWF, and Herb's extracurricular activities. While all of that is so wild and interesting, and it certainly played a key role in the promotion's downfall, I'm going to set most of the more salacious tales aside. Instead, I'm going to try my best to tell the whole story of its rise and demise, the interesting stories and the people who helped build the promotion, and the business blunders that took it down. Herb Abrams grew up in Queens, New York, watching Vince McMahon Sr.'s WWF. He marveled at the likes of Bruno Sammartino, Edouard Carpentier, Dominic DeNucci, and Captain Lou Albano. In 1972, he graduated with an associate's degree from the Fashion Institute of Technology, entering the family clothing business. Herb spent the majority of the 1970s and 80s excelling in consumer fashion. He opened boutiques on both coasts to very lucrative results. And contrary to popular belief, according to a correction from author Jonathan Plombon, only one of those stores was for plus-size women. The idea he owned a chain of them may have come from the fact that he briefly worked as a buyer for Lane Bryant. Abrams, by all accounts, had incredible charm, drive to succeed, and an unbelievable knowledge of the fashion world. So it certainly wasn't all luck. Herb was also never really satisfied with just staying in the retail fashion space, or even fashion in general. He dabbled in selling gold, which he did very well in, but Abrams' ultimate goal wasn't to be an entrepreneur, but an entertainer. He appeared on The Gong Show twice as a singer and got the gong both times. By the mid-1980s, Herb was settled into California, and he enjoyed all the indulgences that the Golden State had to offer. The sunshine, hobnobbing with celebrities at Hollywood parties, and of course, let's say skiing? Yes, diving nose first into fresh powder. It was in California where he first tried to get over in wrestling. Abrams would host wrestler appearances in his stores and attended shows where he and a friend even became known amongst the wrestlers for purchasing entire front rows for themselves and their friends. In 1989, Herb's father Abe passed away of a heart attack at the age of 67. Although they weren't close, the death of his dad certainly had to seem like a wake-up call. That life was too short to play it safe and not take chances. Life was short, and Herb's family had a history of heart disease. He was 34, the time was now to take risks. It definitely shouldn't have been a wake-up call for anything else. No, not at all. Abrams' business life to this point had only brought success, and he was ready to capitalize on that success and take a risk pursuing his lifelong passion: professional wrestling. The national wrestling scene had changed come 1989, and Herb Abrams was not happy about it. He started to believe wrestling wasn't what it used to be. It wasn't the same sport he'd grown up on. He felt now it lacked importance, tradition, and prestige. Herb decided, as so many do, that he would be the one to, say it with me now, bring wrestling back to the good old days. But Abrams was smart enough to know that he couldn't do it on his own, so he went on the hunt for people experienced in wrestling and television to help bring his vision to life. Herb knew the importance of television for a wrestling company, so he contacted TV producer Brandon Pender. Pender had been a producer for the NWA when they would hold California TV tapings, so he had the knowledge and connections Herb needed. He also turned to friend Lenny Doog. Lenny had worked in multiple aspects of television for NBC and Burbank. According to people who worked for UWF, Lenny was a nice man who kept the ship that was the Universal Wrestling Federation afloat. He acted as the middleman between Herb and the boys, and at times reined in Herb's crazier ideas. He was the glue of the whole thing. What's a wrestling TV show without wrestlers, though? For help with that task, Abrams tapped LA-based journeyman wrestler Jack Armstrong. According to Armstrong, he helped Herb contact talents and even assisted with creative. And again, according to Brandon Pender, the pitch to wrestlers was that UWF would be a great transition promotion, a place for them to come and work after being released by the WWF or WCW until they got signed by the other. By 1990, Herb Abrams felt he had all the pieces together and was ready to launch his Universal Wrestling Federation. And he wasn't content to start small and grow. He wanted to dive right into the deep end and compete with the WWF and WCW. According to Brandon Pender, Herb had budgeted $2 million that was supposed to last the company for 5 years. That's about $400,000 a year. Numerous people along the way tried to talk Abrams out of going so big right away. But he was dead set on getting big names and a cable TV spot. And he got both. The original UWF roster consisting of former WWF and NWA names like Brian Blair, Billy Jack Haynes, Dr. Death Steve Williams, and Mr. Wonderful Paul Orndorff. Well, at least they were familiar names. Dr. Death and Mr. Wonderful being the best of the bunch. Herb also hired younger talents that hadn't quite broken out yet, like Dan Spivey, David Sammartino, and Cactus Jack. Similar to Steve Austin in Texas Championship Wrestling, it's really cool to see Mick Foley hitting his stride and figuring out who this Cactus Jack character is. But the talents that were probably Herb's favorite acquisitions were Captain Lou Albano and the living legend Bruno Sammartino, both of whom would have a strong presence on television. UWF also landed that coveted TV spot, joining the Sports Channel America lineup 5 times a week. The network at the time was desperately trying to grow their audience. In 1988, they purchased the rights to NHL games for $51 million over 3 years. The station was also no stranger to wrestling, with ICW, AWA, and Ron Russin's IWA all hitting their airwaves at various times. In fact, it was supposedly the poor performance and cheap look of IWA that had Sports Channel executives concerned about airing another wrestling show. But Abrams brought Paul Orndorff and Bruno Sammartino to the offices, making quite the first impression. UWF would have star power. And with Lenny overseeing things, the executives were put at ease that this wrestling show just might work. Best news for Herb, Sports Channel would cover the production costs of the show for him. Jack Armstrong estimated the total cost was $50,000 to $60,000 per show. Everything was now in place, and at the first John Arezzi Wrestling Convention in August of 1990, Herb Abrams announced the launch of the Universal Wrestling Federation. At the press conference, Herb famously said that Blackjack Mulligan would be the promotion's booker, pretty hard for him to do while he was in prison for counterfeiting. Herb also announced that Bruiser Brody would be coming in. Even more difficult for him to do considering he was murdered in 1988. Ridiculously impossible claims aside, UWF was set to hold their debut event September 13, 1990 at the Anaheim Celebrity Theater. But the show was cancelled the day before when the venue received a letter stating that the permit approved was for entertainment, not sports, which is the category wrestling would fall under. Now, how legitimate this shutdown was depends on who you talk to. Some say that, yeah, the I's weren't dotted, nor were the T's crossed. According to some, Herb needed a promoter's license from the State Athletic Commission, which he did not have at the time. Maybe that's why the permit was submitted as entertainment? Trying to skirt around the lack of a license? I mean, wrestling is entertainment, right? But there's some that suggest a more nefarious reason for the cancellation. Vince McMahon. There was the rumor at the time that WWF may have contacted folks at the venue and laid down the ultimatum that if Herb was allowed to run his show, then Vince would stop running the venue. I can't find any results that show WWF running at the Celebrity Theater, only the Pond and Convention Center. But do we really think Vince was truly concerned about UWF? I don't think he really cared at all. Herb certainly seemed to think it was the WWF. His quote reportedly being, "That Vince did this." UWF would finally hold their first set of TV tapings on September 24, 1990 in Reseda, California, in front of about 300 people. Maybe 450, but probably not. This taping is what would air as the first 3 episodes of UWF Fury Hour, which began airing on October 1st, 1990. The episodes are fine, it's mostly jobber squashes, including Davey Meltzer. I think the thing I hate most about these episodes is the audio. They didn't mic the ring or the crowd, so it's super obvious that Herb and Bruno are doing commentary in post. And I don't know about you, but I enjoy wrestling a lot more when I can hear the slams and bams and grunts. Also, we got robbed of hearing Dr. Death lay in these chops.
Yeah, I mean, already you can see that Davey melts and that chop. Wow, look at the tremendous power behind it.
Bruno, what do we know about his opponent? There goes another clothesline.
The show also doesn't look like the kind of broadcast that can compete with WWF, and it could barely compete with 1990 WCW visually. There's no fancy entranceway, just a black curtain. Hell, even most indies now have this thing. Also, if you notice at the end of the shows, you'll see a company Herb trademarked in 1988, NGK. The initials were his dogs, Nicky, Gucci, and of course, Koki. By episode 6, UWF had fixed the audio issues and also introduced Chief Jay Strongbow, Ken Patera, Cowboy Bob Orton, and Nikita Koloff to the roster. But it's not just 1980 stars coming into this growing company. Herb had promised Hollywood glitz, and really it's just code for gimmicks. So UWF brought in the Viking. Wrestling the way it should be. And take a guess who the Viking is. It's the Helsinki Hellraiser himself, Ludwig Borga. The second set of tapings from October of 1990 didn't draw nearly the crowd they had the first time around. Only about 125 people got to witness the giant surprise UWF had up their sleeve. At the October 11th tapings, Captain Lou unveiled the new assignee to UWF, Andre the Giant. This was a massive get for Herb. Many inside the promotion were shocked Andre even showed up considering his loyalty to Vince. Supposedly, Herb and Andre agreed to an $8,000 per appearance fee, and UWF had the Giant. Thankfully, the footage made air, but even that almost never happened. According to Brandon Pender, the WWF threatened to sue if Andre appeared on TV. But credit to Herb if that's true, he had the guts to test that threat. Andre would appear on episodes 6, 8, and 14, airing November through January, wearing the same shirt in all 3 appearances because they only had him for that one night. By the summer of '91, Andre was back in the WWF whacking around with Luke and Butch. UWF would continue taping TV in Reseda in front of almost no one for the rest of the year. I'm not going to discuss every issue with Fury Hour here, there's other videos you can check out that discuss it. I will say the major issues with the TV show overall were the finishes. Whenever 2 name talent were going against each other, there was always some sort of DQ or double countout, anything to avoid someone having to lose and look weak. Abrams wasn't a booker, and looking at the TV, that much is obvious. Surprisingly though, Cactus Jack vs Chief Jay Strongbow was a really fun match. The promotion kicked off 1991 with a big move to the East Coast. UWF invaded Vince's backyard and taped a couple months of TV at the Penta Hotel, now the Pennsylvania Hotel. At least I think it is. I'm sure the comments will correct me. This is absolutely my favorite venue UWF ever ran. It's got the balconies, that old ballroom vibe. It reminds me a lot of the Hammerstein Ballroom, so I love it. Big fan. But admittedly, some of the angles look terrible. The move to New York would prove to be a mixed bag for UWF. The Fury Hour tapings at the Penta Hotel did great attendance in comparison to California. Though they started out hovering around 900 for the first taping, attendance did steadily decline to about 400 for their last taping in the Big Apple. UWF used this taping to debut more recent WWF free agents like our pal Greg Valentine. He wrestled a couple of matches during the tapings, including one that was cut from broadcast. It also featured a post-match attack by former tag partner the Honky Tonk Man. Rick Rude also debuted in the crowd, teasing matches with Don Morocco and Paul Orndorff. But those matches never happened and Rude never appeared for the promotion again. UWF also hosted house shows in the New York area, their first attempt being the Rumble in Queens on January 10th. The event was canceled when the venue, the Queen's Theater, refused to accept a check from Herb and demanded cash. Abrams declined and 300 fans were turned away the night of the show. Another canceled show presumably hurt locker room morale, but Herb still made sure the boys got paid. The next event on January 12th in West Islip, New York did far better, drawing a crowd of about 800 people to see the main event of Paul Orndorff versus Greg Valentine. But this New York tour would also uncover a lot of problems for UWF. Greg Valentine left after a pay dispute. According to Valentine, Herb canceled a check on him after he'd heard Hammer had met with Vince about a return. It worked out fine though, as he was back in the WWF just a week later for the Royal Rumble. A report by the Wrestling Observer stated that on January 30th, the Honky Tonk Man sent a letter to the New York State Athletic Commission, informing them that Herb Abrams had given him a check that did not clear. The commission had to pay him. By this point, the reality of the situation was starting to set in. Maybe Valentine and Rude not coming back was a good thing. At the time, it was also being reported that the two had walked out on their WWF contracts, and Vince was threatening a lawsuit against UWF again. Meltzer also reported at the time that these court battles with WWF were having an impact on Herb's checkbook. When the boys' checks first started bouncing, Herb played it off as an error. A mistake to be corrected. So to make it right, he would take them out to extravagant dinners. But by this point, just 4 months into the promotion's existence, the truth was becoming harder to hide. In spring of 1991, to try to boost morale and get an influx of cash, Herb took on 2 investors, Ed Barbara and Tom Kenny. No, not the SpongeBob guy. Ed was a friend and business partner of Brian Blair, who came from the marketing world, and he would step in to help with that side of the business. It was Ed Barbara who introduced Herb to Tom Kenny, an executive with MCI Communications. After a meeting in Tampa between the 3 men, UWF had secured funds of $700,000 from the 2 new investors. Speaking of Florida, UWF would expand again, this time into the Sunshine State. They would hold a house show at the War Memorial Auditorium that saw an attendance of 400 fans. Off to an okay start, not like the first New York shows, but it's promising. They would also tape Fury Hour at Universal Studios. Awesome, right? History has shown us that wrestling shows at Disney MGM or Universal do pretty well. They at least look good. Well, that wouldn't be the case for UWF. See, they weren't in some gorgeous studio. They were in the concourse of the park. Instead of making the taping an attraction for the visitors to just come and watch, Herb insisted that it be a separate entry and people pay to get a seat. Only about 50 people paid. So in desperation, Herb changed his mind and decided anyone can come into the show. But it was too late. Because of that, there was no way to hide the crowd size. You can't turn down the lights here because it's the sun. The commentators were Craig DeGeorge and Captain Lou. And they're terrible. Craig DeGeorge is fine, but Lou is so god-awful it brings DeGeorge down. The low turnout and condition of some of the talents after a night of partying with the boss led to a terrible showing for the promotion. The tapings were a disaster. That being said, this taping did give us the strange yet awesome visual of seeing Bob Orton and Paul Orndorff in front of Nickelodeon Studios. It's so 90s, I love it. It was becoming more and more apparent to the roster and staff that Herb's vices were starting to take over. Some took advantage and indulged alongside him, while others found it difficult to deal with. According to an anonymous letter to the Observer, Abrams was turning into a loudmouth bully. He'd cuss out wrestlers, fans, security guards, anyone that was at the wrong place at the wrong time. He also started to think that Vince was spying on him. 6 months in, and things were unraveling more and more each show. In May 1991, UWF returned to the Hotel Pennsylvania for another set of TV tapings. The tapings drew on the lower end of their last visit, somewhere in the 450 range. With money being lost on every show, Herb needed to cut corners. In an effort to save costs, he hired a local 21-year-old college kid who had introduced himself to Abrams some time earlier. Big mistake, kid. The kid agreed to get a crew and a production truck for $12,000. The truck he was able to get was missing some key features needed to be able to properly shoot the show. So he went out and rented the missing pieces. When he tried to get the money to pay his crew, Herb dodged him as long as possible. Then once he was paid, surprise surprise, the check bounced. The production crew threatened to leave. Herb threatened a lawsuit back, saying that they'd be going against their agreement. The kid and the crew, not knowing any better, stayed and shot the show, costing them $18,000. And this was the taping that would take them to their next big venture, pay-per-view. Palmetto, Florida, June 9, 1991. UWF took the next step in competing with Vince and Turner. They had cable TV, now it was time for PPV. It was time for Beach Brawl. Herb wanted to throw everything he could on the show. Championship matches, a street fight, a strap match, bringing Bob Backlund to an American ring for the first time since 1985. Abrams even tried to coax Bruno out of retirement to face young Bobby Rogers, but he couldn't pull it off. To put it simply, Beach Brawl was doomed from the beginning. Many people, both inside and outside the company, questioned why they were even running a pay-per-view at this point with the state the company was in. Brian Blair asked Herb for numbers that supported his decision to run the show, but Abrams never showed him anything concrete. To his credit, he did hire an agency to advertise the show on a couple of radio stations, but it didn't work out well, as by the Wednesday before the show, they had only sold 70 tickets. 70. 7-0. So Herb resorted to handing them out for free. Even then, they only had a live attendance of about 550 people. It was a 4,000-seat building. Maybe it would all be worth it when they got those sweet, sweet pay-per-view buys. That didn't exactly work out for UWF either. At the time, there were about 14 million homes with pay-per-view capabilities. UWF only got clearance on about 2 million of those homes. As the show drew closer, several cable providers dropped the show entirely, presumably because of no interest from their subscribers. Abrams, of course, blamed Vince. At the end of the day, the show bombed. Beach Brawl was purchased by 2,000 homes for a total revenue of $30,000, with UWF only getting about half that, so $15,000. From here, UWF absolutely takes a nosedive, and not the kind of nosedive Herb liked. Their next taping the following month in July was another disaster, and it's when desperation really started to kick in. Cowboy Bob Orton and Paul Orndorff left halfway through the show after they hadn't been paid. This taping also saw Herb Abrams become a part of a UWF storyline. Herb inserted himself into the feud between manager Colonel Red and managerial legend Captain Lou Albano. It really shouldn't come as a surprise that Herb would eventually become involved in storylines. It was only a matter of time. He'd always seen himself as an entertainer and always wanted to be a performer in some way. It was a Hail Mary for the failing promotion. By this point, the UWF's financial woes had become obvious to everyone but Abrams. No longer able to run monthly TV tapings, they wouldn't hold another event until a house show 3 months later in October of '91, at a nightclub that only drew about 50 people. They bounced back a bit the following month in November of '91 with a joint show in partnership with NAWA, bringing in a house of about 450. Herb now had a reputation among buildings and the boys, and not a very good one. The Reseda Country Club, the Penn Hotel, and even the dump that was the War Memorial had all been stiffed, not leaving Herb many options to run his shows. Word had also made the rounds with the boys that if you worked for Herb, there's no guarantee you'll get paid. This unfortunate reputation left UWF to hold shows with mostly talent local to wherever they were running, and only feature 1 or 2 big names that Herb could convince to work. It was here that UWF would start to see the end of the transition model, as many of the big names had disappeared from the roster, giving us such big-time matchups as Midnight Star versus Death Row 3260. UWF around this time also introduced new titles like the Southern States Championship and the Israeli Championship. Meanwhile, Steve Williams and the Sports Channel TV Championship were nowhere to be seen. Dr. Death was firmly entrenched in All Japan, and there was no way he would take the chance on a booking from Herb when he had a guaranteed payday from Baba. Even with dwindling houses and a talent roster that was jumping ship left and right, Herb still had massive expectations for UWF in 1992. But his addiction had completely taken hold. The money for TV went up his nose. The money from his partners, up the nose. The money for talent, up the nose unless you held him over a balcony. Herb's paranoia and anger were also affecting the company's growth and goodwill. Obviously, Herb never let go of the idea that Vince was sabotaging him. So if something went wrong, it wasn't his fault, it was McMahon. And any time Meltzer or any newsletter wrote negatively about UWF, Herb's responses were usually vulgar threats and threats of lawsuits. Herb even threatened to sue a 15-year-old for what he wrote in his newsletter about UWF. 1992 for the promotion started with a major gut punch: the loss of their TV deal. Every week seemed to show a steady decline in the quality of Fury Hour. While the show was never on par with WWF or WCW in terms of production value, there were times towards the end where the network might not even have an episode to air. According to former Sports Channel program director Brian Rico, they'd still be waiting on a tape all day of the show to arrive to be able to air it that night. And accusations that Herb had somehow dropped the ball led to him lashing out. When Herbie says it'll be there, you didn't trust him. The network couldn't trust him to deliver a show. They didn't know where the money was going, and Herb had become increasingly more difficult to work with. It was easy to just cut ties and drop the show. Herb wouldn't give up, though. He had even bigger aspirations than just some TV show filmed in a California country club. In early 1992, Herb started pitching talent on a world tour, 6 weeks in Egypt and 2 months in Australia. And would you believe it? These tours were exactly what UWF needed to get back on their feet. I'm kidding, obviously these tours never happened. Now even the company name was in limbo, because on May 21st, Herb let the trademark for Universal Wrestling Federation expire. The final Fury Hour taping took place in June 1992, 7 months after their last taping. It took place in Spartanburg, South Carolina at the Spartanburg Memorial Auditorium. The show would air on their new home, the even lesser-known Prime Ticket. The network seemed to think very highly of the series, with the program manager stating, "The series garners a very favorable response from viewers, and the production quality of these programs are always excellent." What show were they watching? This last run of TV may have also aired on a couple of the regional sports channel stations. While the taping drew a crowd of 900, only about 300 of those fans paid. Herb tried to bring in more established names like Ivan Koloff and Jimmy Valiant, and more guys with potential like Barry Horowitz and Night Stalker, who would later become Adam Bomb, one half of Chronic, Brian Clark. In July, UWF tried to compete in a new realm of the business, home video. They released several titles, with Herb even appearing at the videotape convention with UWF stars Steve Ray, Paul Orndorff, and their MIA champion, Dr. Death Steve Williams. While the tapes weren't highly sought after in the US, they did do well in Germany and Malaysia. The tapes were so popular in Asia, in fact, that Herb even considered running an 8-stop tour of the region. It would all culminate in a pay-per-view featuring the in-ring debut of Japanese TV character Ultraman. Wrestling, the way it should be. After these ventures, UWF went silent. Then, in October of 1992, Herb entered into an inpatient 28-day rehab facility. His sobriety only lasted a couple of months, as he was arrested for possession not long after. Following the arrest, his wife filed for divorce. 1992 had been a year filled with failure. Somehow more failure than 1990 and 1991. But 1993 would be the cherry bomb atop the Sunday that was the UWF. UWF kicked off the year by canceling an event scheduled for January 17th in Beverly Hills. Great start. Maybe the show was cancelled because Herb was in desperate need of a new support team. So entered journeyman wrestler Al Burke and musician Zoog's Rift. It would actually be Rift who booked their upcoming show. The UWF was back. In July 1993, the promotion held their first event in over a year, UWF Rampage, in the glamorous city of Minot, North Dakota. Minot, North Dakota. The show was another absolute mess. It featured the Killer Bees, Steve Ray, and the main event of newly minted Intercontinental Champion Bob Orton taking on the Warlord. Of course, in the aftermath of the show, there was a series of bounce checks all over town. The talent, the limo company, the production team, the hotel, even the local sports broadcaster Herb brought in to be the ring announcer. They were all stiffed. The show was filmed but never aired anywhere officially. UWF may have been cash poor, but they were rich with lofty and unobtainable ideas. Around the fall of '93, Herb floated around the idea of signing the WWF's biggest star of all time to that point, Hulk Hogan. The Hulkster had left the WWF for Thunder in Paradise in June after the King of the Ring. Allegedly, Hogan had found out about Herb's interest and offered to do 3 appearances for $1 million. I don't think even Herb would stoop so low to bounce that large of a check. The rest of 1993 saw no more shows booked after Rampage. The year did, however, see a couple booked and cancelled shows, several lawsuits, and in December, multiple arrests for Herb Abrams. Once again being arrested for possession in Malibu, and 2 weeks later on New Year's Eve, he was arrested again for causing a massive amount of damage to a hotel room. The exact story you're probably thinking of, with him ripping open pillows for listening devices and all that. Herb was able to get off with just probation both times thanks to several character letters asking the court for leniency. Also supposedly working in Herb's favor was his FBI agent brother-in-law, allegedly. But Herb had one more major Hail Mary throw left in him for 1994, and would be the biggest one yet. A live special from the newly opened MGM Grand Garden Arena in Las Vegas. It would be the Blackjack Brawl. The Blackjack Brawl had been in the works since late 1993 when UWF got into contact with the management of the MGM Garden Arena. The arena had just opened New Year's Eve 1993. We all know what Herb was up to on that evening. The venue prided itself on being family-friendly, and television wrestling at the time was still very much a family-oriented endeavor, so Herb and UWF were a great fit at the MGM. Herb assigned booking duties once again to Zoog's Rift. He had the show pretty much 100% booked by March, which is also when he finally quit. He'd had enough of Herb scheduling events and then canceling them over and over. He also wasn't getting paid consistently by the promotion. So he was gone and Herb took the already booked show and put his spin on it. This included removing Terry Funk from the planned main event. Herb refused to pay his $1,200 fee. Big question was, how would Herb pull this show off? It wouldn't be easy, but Herb was going to pull every string, turn over every rock, and bounce every check he could to make it happen. But it was almost all ripped away before he could even get started. One of the first things he did was contact old friend Brian Rico. Rico had since left Sports Channel for Showtime and wanted to help Herb get UWF back on track. So according to Rico, he suggested airing the show as a live special. Rico initially suggested Showtime, but knew UWF didn't have the capabilities required. So he helped Herb make some arrangements back at their old home Sports Channel to air the show on their regional stations. Prior to the event, former UWF manager Colonel Red, Marty Yasberg, wrote a letter to the Nevada State Athletic Commission advising against them allowing the show to take place, citing Herb's business practices and other issues. As he states in the letter, Mr. Abrams is a con man of the greatest proportions. It's probably an understatement. Herb responded in part, "Undoubtedly there are a number of individuals out in the business world envious of my endeavors and jealous of my success, and thus turn to antics such as the letter of Mr. Marty Yasberg, as a means to undermine UWF and discredit me personally. I, of course, take exception to these improper methods." He continued, "I have expended a great deal of time, energy, and money in preparation for our September 23, 1994 exhibition. I expect it to be nothing less than spectacular. Mr. Yasberg's efforts have fallen significantly short of the mark, and neither you nor I should give any weight or credibility to these wrongful types of intimidations." And the MGM agreed with Herb. They weren't deterred from working with him and allowed the show to happen. The weeks leading up to the event was a constant reshuffling of the card. Tito Santana was pulled from his match against Dan Spivey and replaced with Johnny Ace. Barbarian was pulled from the Powers of Pain vs. Killer Bees match and replaced by Larry Power of the Power Twins. Why not just use both Power Twins instead?
Hey! Shut up!
After signing with WCW, Jim Duggan was pulled and replaced by Irish Assassin in his match with Hercules. Hercules was then replaced in the match with Irish Assassin by Samson. A match with two of the roidiest, most lumbering, untalented lummoxes I've ever seen in a ring. Magnificent Mimi was pulled from the Women's Championship match against Candy Devine and replaced by Tina Moretti. Yep, Ivory. Finally an upgrade, I love that. Due to the UWF's inactivity and their minuscule television reach, they weren't able to advertise widely. There were some radio spots in Vegas, a TV ad here and there, and Missy Hyatt remembered the MGM casino being covered in posters for the event, but not being sure that they were up anywhere else. As a result, the 10,000-seat arena was filled with only about 1,600 in attendance, with about 1,000 of those being comps. The day of the show was an absolute train wreck. Herb showed up to the event high as a 747, and according to people who were there, he pretty much stayed that way the entire event. Many talents requested their pay before the show as to avoid working without it. For Herb, this was a problem, seeing as he had no money. So, he and Steve Ray negotiated a deal with the MGM that saw $100,000 show up to make sure all was handled. The majority of that cash went to the production team since UWF needed cameras and all that to get the show on the air. The Blackjack Brawl is widely regarded as one of the worst shows of all time, and it was even voted Wrestling Observer's worst major wrestling show of 1994. The matches aren't good, although some of them are fun. Cactus Jack vs. Jimmy Snuka really stands out as a fun one to watch. It's a lumberjack match, but the action spills out all around the empty building. As Mick would say years later,
I remember Brian Blair going, "What are you doing?" I said, "It's Herb's show. We can do whatever we want."
one of the major issues for me is the amount of championship matches. Specifically, new championships that are being determined on the show. Of the 11 matches on the card, 9 of them were for titles. Of those 9 title matches, 5 of them were new belts. I think it'd be fine if it was a new promotion, or a promotion that was thriving, that was growing. This just screams desperation. Like they were begging for viewers by giving the illusion of a big card. Look at all the title matches we have scheduled! And to call this show bad, I don't think is a knock on the quality of the talent. Aside from everyone I've mentioned already, there was Mondo Guerrero, and Borgo was back after leaving the WWF. In the main event of Sid Vicious vs. Steve Williams for the UWF World Championship? On paper, that's a main event I would be very interested in seeing. But in reality, they were just going through the paces for the payday, and a DQ finish. Embarrassing for them, I'm sure. The show was 3 hours long and really only had about 70 minutes of wrestling. The rest is just Herb Abrams rambling and making a spectacle of himself in front of the crowd. You all know the various things he said on the show. It's all iconic and has become infamous.
Yeah, drink sake tonight.
We drink sake tonight.
Yeah, collaboration, right?
You say kampai?
Kampai, yes.
I say,
How do you know kampai?
how do I know kampai? Yeah. I used to be married to a Japanese girl.
Oh, yeah?
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Congratulations, Little Tokyo.
I'm sure it goes without saying at this point, but most people on the show got checks that bounced. Even one half of the main event got stiffed. Sid wanted to kill Abrams. He probably had to miss softball for this show. So yeah, not exactly the kind of resurrection UWF needed. This catastrophe of a show would be its last. But at least Herb had those awesome boots. After Blackjack Brawl, Herb Abrams never gave up on the possibility that UWF could make a comeback. If he was still alive, then UWF stood a chance. He'd licensed the video library internationally, hoping to generate some revenue. The company had dug quite the hole, though. Supposedly, Herb Abrams Productions was in the red by $10 million. In 1995, Herb's mother fell ill and he returned to New York to be with her. Some say there may have been a more scandalous reason for his departure from California. Herb did run in some unsavory circles, so who knows? Abrams' addiction continued to worsen while in New York and occasional trips back out west. He would try to get back into wrestling a few different ways, none of which ever panned out. In April 1995, Herb licensed the UWF footage to ESPN Classic, where it ran for years. That's actually how I discovered UWF in the early 2000s as a teenager. I never thought it was good, but it was wrestling on TV after school with Cactus Jack. Couldn't ask for anything better. The ESPN deal also led to rumors that Herb was bringing UWF back from the dead. He was absolutely trying to, but was never able to make it happen. In April 1996, he was arrested again, this time for allegedly holding a woman hostage at his office. Piece of shit. They also found cocaine on him. Big surprise. On July 23, 1996, Herb Abrams died after a massive heart attack while in police custody. He was 41 years old. He'd gone on one final coke-fueled rampage, destroying his office with a baseball bat covered in cocaine and baby oil. But you probably knew that already. Herb Abrams was dead, and with his death, so went his UWF. If you've seen this series before, then you know this is the point where I put the positive spin on a promotion and its demise. Unfortunately, UWF doesn't lend itself to that spin. I could say they gave big names somewhere steady to work until their next contract. But those talents didn't get paid. I could say they challenged the big two and a sizable audience flocked to the alternative. But they never surpassed 900 in attendance. I can't even say that they had good wrestling. It was really hit or miss. What I can say is UWF wasn't created out of greed. It wasn't created to feed an old wrestler's ego, and it didn't fail because the owner didn't care about wrestling. Herb Abrams loved pro wrestling. By all accounts, he wanted it to succeed, and he wanted to give like-minded fans a show they could enjoy and be proud to be fans of. It just wasn't possible. The audience and the talent just weren't there. Herb had two of the most expensive vices you can have: drugs and pro wrestling. As Jim Cornette has said, best way to make $1 million in wrestling is to start with $2 million. I really believe Herb set out to start a real alternative. I believe that he thought he'd planned everything financially the best he could. That he really thought it would work. And then everything collapsed too quickly for him to get his bearings and come up with a plan. So all he could do was scam and lie his way out of trouble. He'd been legitimately successful before wrestling. He had a great mind for business, but maybe not the business. I don't think he came into wrestling a carny, but he certainly left it the worst of them all. Or maybe I'm a giant mark and he was a con man all his life. As Mick Foley said in his book, to know Herb Abrams was to like him, or at least be amused by him. If you like this video, I cannot recommend my primary source, Tortured Ambition by Jonathan Plombon, enough. It's got great interviews, never before seen photos, new insights into the man, the company, and all the wild stories. And it also has match-by-match breakdowns of all the shows, which is really interesting. There's also a Facebook page where corrections are made, which I think is great. If you're interested in the story of Herb Abrams and the story of UWF, I suggest picking it up. It's available on Amazon in both digital for Kindle and physical book form. To date, there's been no official UWF home media releases since its VHS tapes 30 years ago. However, you can find it on the Savoldi streaming site Ultimate Classic Wrestling, as well as here on YouTube and other parts of the World Wide Web. I'm Scott from WrestleSpective. Watch wrestling, love wrestling. Thanks for watching this monstrosity of a video.